First of all, because Israel's attack on Iran really didn't solve anything. In reality, they didn't completely destroy Iran's nuclear program, and now this is a subject of hot debate. So there is this moment of emphasizing Iranian nationalism over Shia identity, Islamic identity. Now, does this work? Will it work over time? We don't know. We're still in the fog of war.
Hello. On the 13th of June this year, 1 month ago, Israeli forces launched aerial and drone attacks on Iran, thus beginning what is now called the 12-Day War or the Iran-Israel War. The coverage here in the West is focused on whether the bombing has been successful. But is there a strategic goal in place that takes into account Iran's strategy? Perhaps, but my guest today is Vali Nasr, who has written a new book, Iran's Grand Strategy, A Political History, which is both timely and unusual in that it seeks to examine Iran's Islamic regime from its own point of view, and so not through our Western lens. We discuss the events that have moulded the Iran at loggerheads with Israel and the US today. Plenty more different subjects on the way, including Prince Rupert of the Rhine and Henry III. Please do share with the like-minded. Until then, it's me talking with Vali Nasr on Iran's Grand Strategy. Okay, Vali, thank you very much for joining me. It's a huge pleasure to have you on. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me. It's great to be on this podcast.
Well, we're here to talk about a new book, Iran's Grand Strategy, A Political History. And I mean, it's timed well for obvious reasons. And I was very keen to speak to you because I had read about the book and then I've been reading the proof that your publisher kindly sent to me. And I find this as a perspective that I don't think many listeners, certainly not me, and I'm actually actively interested in the subject beyond, reading the news. And I find the way you're explaining the history of the Islamic Republic since the revolution gives a perspective that we don't necessarily see in the West, in that you're very much explaining what is going through the mind of the successive governments since the revolution. I wondered if we could start off really just by what do you think we get wrong in the West? Are we not placing ourselves in the shoes of the administration of the Islamic Republic?
Well, let me put it this way. I mean, the reason I thought about this book is, first of all, I see that there is a great deal of very active, furtive debates on strategic issues in Iran. And it's the most dominant theme in discussion of statecraft among the political class, security forces, leaders of the Islamic Republic. And that's obviously a treasure trove of information, which we don't tap into. I think a lot of the views of the West about Iran is calcified in the notion that this is a theocracy born of an Islamic revolution. And then there is an overhang of 9/11 analysis that, it's Islam and the Quran and religious reading that basically decides the way the Islamic Republic behaves. Why is it anti-American? Why is it anti-Israeli? And we don't take seriously that there is a strategic calculation on the other side. And whether we like it or not, just like whether we like what Putin is doing in Ukraine or not, you have to get an understanding about what that mindset is, what are its assumptions, and how does it analyze and perceive things. And in many ways, I also came to see that this national security perspective, if you want to call it, this strategic outlook, is what has really shaped Iran. I mean, Iran, in a way, is a state that has been at war since the revolution, at least in its own mind. It was in a war with Iraq for 8 years, which was very formative. Then it has been in this shadow war with America and then with Israel, and periodically this outburst like the recent war we're seeing. And wars make states, as famously Charles Tilly put it. It's not ideology that has made the Islamic Republic. It is war that has made the Islamic Republic. And this is where we get it wrong. We have to understand how war has made the Islamic Republic. And if I can put it simply, if you looked at the history of Islamic Republic, at least from this angle, and I don't want to say this is the only angle one ought to look at, but the other angles have been amply looked at already. Where I think my contribution is to look at this, and my conclusion is this is not so much as a theocracy as it is a national security state. It is a state that has been built in war, for war, and my sense is that the current war with Israel and the United States will only amplify this. This is a country under siege, it's vulnerable, it's insecure, and the way that it interacts with the world, and the way also it builds its relationship with its society, and who has power in Iran and who makes decision, is all have to do with management of this ongoing conflict.
So if we take that premise then, that it's essentially in a sort of defensive mode, it views itself as surrounded by enemies, or particularly to its west. How does that fit in with the governmental structure, which has been in place since the revolution, in that the Ayatollah is, of course, the spiritual leader, but also he's the political leader as well? What's the relationship between the president and the Ayatollah, and how does that affect the way that they administer the state vis-a-vis their enemies?
So this relationship, as you mentioned, between the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, and the president is enshrined in the Constitution, which goes back to the very beginning of the revolution, and the Constitution was revised when the founder of the revolution, Ayatollah Khomeini, died, and the current supreme leader became the head of state. Now, I would say, very sort of crudely put it, it's very much like the country of France, where there is a president and then there's a prime minister. And the president is the one who's in charge of statecraft, foreign policy, the grand things, and the prime minister in France is in charge of running the trains, the day-to-day administration of the country. And the supreme leader in Iran has that quality of an imperial president like the French have, except he's not elected and he's not accountable. And the president in Iran basically runs the government. So he's not insignificant, but he's not like the presidents of other countries. He's more like the prime minister of France. But where things have, this war has changed, this state of war has changed things, is that Iran's supreme leader, the Ayatollah, really doesn't see himself as a spiritual leader. He's really the commander-in-chief of Iran's military forces. He sees himself as the perfect leader for Iran because, yes, he went to seminary and has religious credentials and has a turban on his head. He also has ran government. He was Iran's president before he became supreme leader. He, by many accounts, is a policy wonk, as they call him in the United States. He likes reading reports. He's sort of very at home with administrative, economic, political things. But he also is the commander-in-chief of Iran's security forces. According to the constitutional revisions that were happening in 1989, he appoints the commanders of the Revolutionary Guards, of the regular military. He oversees the war planning, and they're accountable to him, not to Iranian president or to Iranian parliament. And essentially, he's the one who defines Iran's strategic outlook, and he runs these affairs. And now, this confrontation with the US or the Iran-Iraq war, when it happened in the 80s, doesn't change the constitution so much as it changes the balance of power within the existing institutions. For instance, over time, the Revolutionary Guards have become more and more and more powerful, as militaries tend to do when countries are at war. They take over increasing areas of government, ministries that are critical to national security, planning for the economy, domination of society, etc. Larger chunk of the budget goes to them. And then the economic sanctions and isolation that Iran faces also shapes its economy and society as well. Because as it's pushed underground, it becomes more and more securitized. So it's not so much in the constitutional makeup of the state, but it's in the makeup of those who run Iran and the balance of power between men in uniform and civilians that actually this kind of war footing is seen. And so, the more time goes on, there's a sort of gradually you see Iran has become more and more dominated by the Revolutionary Guards. And the religious sector is there, but the religious sector is now increasingly in the background. Iran today, as we are speaking, is a lot more like Pakistan or Egypt, countries that might have a civilian face, but the power really lies in the hands of the military, and they exercise it from behind the scenes in all manner of dexterous ways.
So, how did that change with the onset of the new regime in 79? Because prior to that, we had the Shah, of course, and the military were a significant power under the Shah. Is this simply replacing the old sort of military leaders with a new military force, the Revolutionary Guards? And therefore, as you say, successive conflicts, they've just grown bigger. So it's you replacing one military group with another?
Well, you're correct. Iran now has really two military groups, and over time it debated whether it should integrate them or not. There is a remnant of the Shah's military. So it is Iran's national military force. It's still there. And then through the crucible of revolution, essentially, the revolution produced its own Praetorian Guard, which is the Revolutionary Guards. They weren't planned for at the beginning. They were born during the Iran-Iraq War because the regular military was very good at stopping Iraq's advancement into Iran in the very beginning, but it really couldn't fight Iraq because the Iranian military under the Shah was based on classical military warfare doctrines. It needed tanks and artillery and air force. And the West was not going to sell these things to Iran anymore. So Iran could not fight Iraq with its old military. It still was there. But then it stumbled upon these younger volunteers, 17, 18-year-olds, who volunteered for the war and with very light weaponry engaged in guerrilla warfare, kind of like Viet Cong style, against the Iraqi forces, and they proved to be extremely effective. In fact, they're the ones who pushed Iraq out of Iran's territory. And so they were born essentially as a force. And in fact, if you look at all the commanders of the Revolutionary Guards today, including, for instance, the famous one that the US killed, General Qasem Soleimani, they were all 17, 18-year-olds who went to the battle. That's where they learned their craft. They didn't go to officer training school, or they were not, enlisted into a formal military. And then they never integrated these two forces. They never completely cashiered the old military. So the old military is there. It polices a lot of the borders on Iran's east in particular. But the Revolutionary Guards really grew as Iran's true elite military force, and it sort of dominates the security arena in Iran. The similarity with the Shah's period is that the Shah, like the supreme leader, saw himself as king. He was king, he was a civilian, but he was the commander in chief of Iran's military. So he appointed all the military commanders down to the rank of colonel, and then they all responded to him. And the military under the Shah never produced a single figure that was equivalent to like General Sisi in Egypt, that, the commander in chief who's the big one. And it's the similar thing in Iran. You have a lot of Revolutionary Guard commanders, but there's not one that speaks for the entire force. That is Ayatollah Khamenei himself, much like the Shah was in that time period. But then the makeup of the Revolutionary Guards is pretty different. Its involvement in politics, along with the military in Iran, is way beyond what the military was under the Shah. And then I would add, Oliver, there's the other similarity. I mean, some of the fundamentals about Iran are not different. Iran, even under the Shah, felt alone in the Middle East. Iranians are Persian-speaking, Persian identity in a sea of Arabs and Turks. Also, the relationship to Islam is through Shiism in a sea of Sunnis. So they are in the Middle East, but they're not welcome in the Middle East. Now, during the Shah's period, that was true. Nasser, Arab nationalism, they were all hostile to Iran. And it's also true here under the Islamic Republic, except the Shah had initially, in his earlier years, adopted the policy of, well, you don't want us, we don't want you either. We don't want to be part of this region. Although in his later years, he was following policies was leaning into the Middle East. He was building alliances with Sadat. He was supporting Shias in Lebanon. He interfered in Iraq's civil war between Kurds and Arabs. He deployed troops in Oman to fight insurgency. He also wanted the Persian Gulf essentially to be an Iranian lake, which is the same thing that the Islamic Republic wants. And he also built a nuclear program. That's where the origins are. And some of the way he saw the nuclear program, including, well, this is all for civilian purposes, if push comes to shove, who knows, is very much the same policy as the Islamic Republic. So, there are certain fundamental geopolitical realities about a big country in a sea of unwelcoming, Middle East around it that is not that different. And except the Islamic Republic has decided to lean into the Middle East, into the Arab Middle East through Shiism and supporting the Palestinian cause and trying to win acceptance by being on the forefront of Arab cause and on the Palestinian issue, whereas the Shah, I think, had a much more deft foreign policy. And I just add one other thing. I mean, for most of the Shah's life, the greatest threat to Iran, at least in his mind, was the Soviet Union. Whereas for the Islamic Republic, the greatest threat to Iran is the United States of America. So in that balance, the Shah saw that alliance with Britain and then the United States was vital for Iran's survival. In fact, I think that was really the fight he had with Prime Minister Mossadegh in 1953. Whereas the Islamic Republic never took the Soviet Union seriously, and then the Soviet Union disappeared. And in its mind, it sees the United States as the main enemy. And therefore, it's organized itself against anti-Americanism, which was never the Shah's issue.
Yes, reading your book, I almost get the sense that it's defined by its anti-Americanism, which to me, well, it's, I guess, ultimately a government, which, as you also write about, does define a country to a certain extent, certainly its political, strategy. But it seems such a shame because Iran is this country with all this potential.
Very true. And I think many Iranians now share that view. This is, the reality is that the revolutionaries in Iran, and I mean by revolutionaries, not just the religious revolutionaries, but also the Marxist-Leninists who were a big part of the revolutionary movement, as well as the liberals, which were the leftovers of the 1953 coup in Iran. They all, I think, overread the 1953 coup as an American British engineered event, and therefore the reading of Iranian history, contemporary history, was very focused on Western meddling in Iran, and I think in its early years, the Islamic Republic was convinced that the Americans were going to stage another coup in Iran. That's why they wanted the American embassy closed. That's why they attacked and took hostages, etc. And I think in the early years of the revolution, they were able to justify this policy and sell it to their population. But over time, I think this anti-Americanism became self-fulfilling. In other words, you kick America, America kicks you back. You feel afraid, you kick again, they kick you back. They put more sanctions on you. You don't know how to get out of the sanctions. You build a nuclear program, then that sanctions get increased. And so the anti-Americanism basically became a straitjacket. They have toyed with getting out of it, like signing a nuclear deal. But the price the United States puts on relaxing things is too high for them. It's really looking for a Deng Xiaoping moment in Iran before it would consider relaxing things, and they can't go that far, so they're now locked in here. But in the process, I think, as is evident, at least over the past decade and a half, they've started to lose their population. I think more and more Iranians are now born after the revolution. I think overwhelming majority of the population is perhaps born after the revolution. In fact, a large number are even born after the Iran-Iraq war, and they don't identify with a generation whose point of reference was the 1953 coup. They don't see, okay, even if we are as anti-American as the Turks or the Chinese, but look at them, they have embassies and airline flights and they can travel. Why are we so isolated? Why are we under so much economic pressure? And also that it doesn't look to them like Iran can sustain the cost of this degree of isolation and confrontation with the West. And so there is no longer a sort of a uniform acceptance of this unique policy that Iran has built for itself. And I think the Achilles heel of this strategy is that it's very firm in the mind of Iran's rulers, but the population is increasingly divorced from it, and it's very similar maybe to the Shah's period, where looking back you would say yes, his policy of fearing the Soviet Union, wanting to be very pro-American, was makes perfect sense, but but he couldn't communicate this to his population. His population was focused on anti-British sentiments because of 1953, anti-Americanism because of 1953. The students were enamored with leftist ideas of Europe of 1970s. And so, what looked like a very sane foreign policy basically had no support among his own population. And so I think Iranians are where you are. I think that part of the problem is that the Islamic Republic wants to negotiate with the US, wants to bargain over its nuclear program, wants to get to a better place, but it hasn't been successful. It wasn't successful because the US came out of the 2015 nuclear deal. It wasn't successful this time around because it ended up in war. And I think they're still open to talking to the US, as you and I are speaking. But and that shows that they are at an impasse with their strategy.
Hello, Ollie here. Please forgive my interruption, but I wanted to let you know that at Aspects of History, we produce a digital magazine featuring articles, interviews, short stories, and book reviews of the best historical writing available. Authors featured including Ben Macintyre, Lucy Worsley, Andrew Roberts, and plenty more. An annual subscription is available for only $9.99. That's pounds or dollars. Yep, you heard that right. That's 6 issues for under £10 or dollars. Head over to aspectsofhistory.com to subscribe, where you can also gift subscriptions. Now back to the show. Well, now you mentioned sort of contemporary events. Do you think then that, this is difficult because it seems as though the Americans were bounced into this attack by the Israelis. If one were to look at Trump a month ago, you wouldn't really know that he's very unpredictable, of course, but there were no indications that the US was going to start bombing Iran. And then it happened because the Israelis went in. Do you think then that this is ultimately because it's not necessarily well-prepared plan, and there seems to be a sort of hope that there will be an uprising from the ground up thanks to a few airstrikes, that this is really a failed strategy and that we're just going to carry on with what we've seen since 79, in that you'll see the Islamic Republic and this is another cycle of being attacked?
Yes, you're absolutely correct. That's my read of it as well. First of all, because Israel's attack on Iran really didn't solve anything. In reality, they didn't completely destroy Iran's nuclear program. And now this is a subject of hot debate about how much is destroyed, how far they've been set back. And, and now the argument is that Iran is embracing this strategy of nuclear ambiguity. In other words, not showing its hands what it's doing and not showing its hands what it has and what's been damaged. Secondly, if Israel's attack was intended to force a collapse of the Islamic Republic by decapitating the system as it did with Hezbollah, that didn't happen either. And then there was no mass uprising, as you said. So Iranians are caught between a regime they don't like and patriotism, an attack on their country, and also they given Israel's record in Gaza and South Lebanon, it creates a lot of fear about what Israel may be up to. So they're not necessarily enthusiastic about embracing an Israeli war on Iran. So basically, nothing was solved as far as Israel was concerned, and so that means that the situation is frozen, right? So blood has been drawn by both sides, but the situation is frozen. I think within the Islamic Republic, there is this same debate that has been there, that we need to obviously build back our defenses. They can't dominate our airspace the way they did. We need to build more missiles. We need to, toughen up, and that obviously means more Revolutionary Guards, more of the national security mindset. And in addition, how did they penetrate our intelligence this way? So we got to go around, we got to plug the holes, we got to find out who the spies are, etc. But on the other side, they're also want to explore, some kind of a de-escalation with the U.S., as they did in 2013 to 2015, as they did with the Biden administration, and as they were doing with Trump. But the problem there is, Trump is the same president who backed out of the previous nuclear deal, and then they see this phase also with a great deal of suspicion. They were still talking to him. There was no Israeli attack on Iran without him giving the green light, because even practically, Israel has to inform U.S. military that it's going to be flying through their radar lines in Iraq and Jordan to get to Iran. So there's no element of surprise for the Americans. And so how do you sort of look at this? Do we sit back at the table? And then what if he pulls another Israeli attack in the middle of the talks? And then what if we conclude the talks and then he pulls another attack? So there's not a straight path, if you would, to negotiations for them. And I think this sort of freezes the situation. They're not vulnerable enough to fall right now, but they don't have an easy way out of the situation that they're in.
One area that I was very interested in, and you've sort of alluded to it as well, which is the population, which the sense one gets, certainly I get from speaking to family members, and so that's very unscientific and of course influenced by them not living in Iran, but that over time since the revolution there was a groundswell of support for the overthrow of the Shah, and throughout the Iran-Iraq war, the population was largely in support of the regime. It's fallen more and more, and so now there are very few in support of the regime itself today, and that seems to have declined more steadily since the movement in '09 and then in 2022. But is that wishful thinking? And really, there is a sort of significant working class who still support the regime.
No, I think the regime is in trouble in varieties of ways. You would say the middle class, upper middle class, the more affluent Iranians, the main issue with the Islamic Republic, some of it is economic, but main issues is cultural and political. They don't want to wear hijab. They don't want religious rules. They also want to be able to travel. They don't like Iran's isolation. They want a normal country, right? And then you have the poor, who are probably ideologically and culturally closer to the regime, but they're the ones who are really suffering economically because of the massive isolation. And also, they are looking at the fact that the Islamic Republic, in a very bizarre way, has become a very segregated society. You have a 1% class, if you would, and the top in Tehran with Lamborghinis and Ferraris and living incredibly ostentatious lives. And then the poor see this as corruption. They see this as injustice. So to them, this is betrayal of the revolution's claims to be about social justice, which was the original sense. So the Islamic Republic has to deal with both of these disquiets. Now, the irony is that these two groups don't get along. And that's why, for instance, the uprisings over hijab 2 years ago didn't catch fire in that sense. There is a sort of it's almost like in an American sense where I'm sitting, you think about New York and San Francisco and the liberal coast, and then you think about middle America, and that's a very different place, right? And so some of that is applies to Iran as well. But I think, the particularly people outside of Iran think of this as black and white, that you're either support the war on Iran because you hate the Islamic Republic so much that you even would support war on Iran to topple it, or you support the Islamic Republic and therefore you're opposed to war. But large majority of Iranians don't live in the black and white. They live in a gray area in the middle, that they can be both opposed to the Islamic Republic and opposed to war, and that they could actually see the Islamic Republic separate from their own country. And in fact, after the first night's attack on Iran, which killed Revolutionary Guard commanders and attacked nuclear sites, the gray area expanded because Israel's campaign against Iran began to hit more and more civilian targets, and also like order to evacuate the city of Tehran petrified the population. That first of all made them very quickly understand that war is going to be disruptive to their daily lives, and nobody knows for how long. In other words, even if Israel is just trying to change the regime, if you thought the most rosy picture here, how long do I have to leave Tehran? And why do I have to leave Tehran? Are they going to level my house? In other words, the idea that somehow the war would be neat and clean and very surgical, and it only kills Khamenei and 5 Revolutionary Guard commanders and gets rid of the Islamic Republic began to sort of become much more complicated for people who actually live in Iran. And so, the love of country, love of their lives made them much more opposed to war. Israel became hatred of Israel at one point became much stronger than hatred of the Islamic Republic. So I think majority of Iranians are in this gray area. The question is, what happens to this gray area as we go forward? Do they move? Do they stay in the gray area? Do they move to the white area? Do they move to the black area? We don't know. I mean, that's part of the entire discussion that's going on in Iran. I mean, there's talk about even among hardliners on their websites, tweets, etc., that people in Iran stood with us. We should stand with them. You should let go of the hijab issue. You should basically try to woo people to support the state, because Iranians rallied together around nationalism, right? And in fact, as we're speaking, and right after the war ended, was the start of the holy month of Muharram, during which the most important religious celebrations happen. And it's very interesting that these professional elegists, people who, sing religious elegies, and usually this is all in the praise of the third Shia Imam who was martyred in Karbala and was the beginnings of Shiism. They replaced that with basically talking about Iran. And in fact, when Ayatollah Khamenei appeared first time after the war at this religious event commemorating the martyrdom of the third Shia Imam, there's a point at which he asked the elegist first to come to him and whispers in his ears, and this is all broadcast, that I want you to basically, your first elegy be this elegy which is about Iran, not about the Shia Imam, right? So there is this moment of emphasizing Iranian nationalism over Shia identity, Islamic identity. Now, does this work? Will it work over time? We don't know. It really, we're still in the fog of war. We're only, as you and I are speaking, about 10 days going forward. So it's impossible, even as social scientists, historians, when we think, to sort of take the past as prologue to the future. right? Just because it happened 2 years ago that way, that this is going to be Iranian society and Iranian psyche, 6 months from now or a year from now. And unfortunately, the Iranians outside are not, and myself included, are not necessarily the best barometer for this, because we are not living in that society in a way that we are dealing with its pain, sorrow, and we're not in the thick of the conversation. And so we're observers. And I would separate myself as an Iranian American from myself as a sort of an analytical observer of Iran. And I think like all expatriate communities, its interpretation of the war is skewed because it didn't experience it directly, and then it's
And I,
not also within that society right now.
I guess another word of caution for those who are enthusiastically supporting these airstrikes is I'm trying to think of when air power alone can cause a kind of groundswell of uprising in favor of those of the airstrikes. I mean, if we your book does this very well. Is if you place yourself in the position of those people in Iran. I mean, Keir Starmer is not the most popular prime minister. I'm not for a moment comparing him with the supreme leader, of course. But if we started being bombed by the French, I think we'd pretty soon rally round, a kind of ideal of Britain, as opposed to want to overthrow Keir Starmer. Again, I'm not
No,
comparing him.
absolutely. I mean, no, absolutely. I mean, we underestimate how fiercely nationalistic Iranians can be. And secondly, uh, the Islamic Republic will go or will change profoundly. It's a question of timing and mechanism and when. We can't tell when, but in its current form, with its limitations, with its strategic deadlock, which I outline in the book, it's bound to change. The question is, will the change be like in China and the Soviet Union? In other words, it will be through a Deng Xiaoping or a Boris Yeltsin, which we should remember, both were establishment guys before they weren't. Mayor of Moscow, lieutenant to Mao, or will it be like Iraq or Afghanistan? And that, as well as when the British occupied Tehran in 1945 and changed the monarchy, requires foreign troops to be in Tehran. And also the Iranians can't look at Iraq or Afghanistan and really think this was a really successful model, right? But you're correct. Air war alone won't do it. And the best that air war can do is at some point turn Iran into Iraq under Saddam, sort of securitized in that way. Or to do something which actually the regime in Iran has been very prolific in the past 2-3 years of socializing the idea of Syrification of Iran. In other words, turning Iran into Syria. And in other words, what will the air war do? Keep destroying infrastructure, electrical grid, etc., roads, hospitals, etc. And then what would happen? What would happen is that the country basically will degrade. It's not a leader goes out of the right door and a new leader comes in the left door. And I think one of the things that may happen is that more and more Iranians come to the realization that neat and clean regime change of the kind the US promised in Iraq is not going to happen. And perhaps the best case scenario for them would be a Deng Xiaoping, would be a Boris Yeltsin. In other words, and that's not going to come on a parachute dropped by an American or Israeli aircraft on Iran. It has to be a product from within the system. But how that will happen, when will that happen, is not an exact science, or if it will happen. And whether the pace of war would be more rapid than the pace of change in Iran is to be seen. So I think the country right now is basically sitting in the middle of an enigma. Its problems have compounded further. Its solutions are not obvious. And there's all of this internal debate among the population, among the elite, and between the population and the political elite about, how do you move forward?
Okay, with that in mind, then one of the tactics deployed by the Israelis is to take out the sort of senior leaders of the Revolutionary Guard Corps. Could they get to a stage where they keep on getting bumped off, so they eventually one of them emerges and decides to become the Yeltsin character? So in a strange way, the air war does work.
It could. I mean, the historical case that comes to my mind is when the Basque separatists in the 1970s killed the successors to General Franco, General Carrero Blanco, in an assassination. They didn't do it to bring democracy to Spain, but the consequence was that when Franco died, the all-powerful successor wasn't there, and that created an opening that brought King Juan Carlos to power and constitutional democracy to Spain. I mean, that's obviously a much neater, cleaner example, but that's an example when that kind of an assassination actually had a positive outcome.
Well, we have a crown prince in the wings, although I'm skeptical. But does your analogy go that far?
Well, the difference is that Juan Carlos had a relationship with politicians and the military inside Spain. This crown prince doesn't. And I think he's become too directly associated with the Israeli military campaign. And I think that ultimately, again, once the fog of war clears, I think he's more like General Pétain in France than he's like Juan Carlos, right? And that I think he's unfortunately compromised his own legitimacy in a very big way. But I think the critical issue is, can Israel keep up this assassination? You see, you can surprise once, but can it keep surprising? Right? Already, the word is that they wanted to kill the supreme leader, they didn't manage. And in his interview with Tucker Carlson, which just came out, Iran's president says that they actually did try to kill him. And from what I've heard, the attempt was made. They didn't succeed. And so, can the Israelis keep this up? Can they keep assassinating? Or this was a card they played once, it didn't work, but you can't play the same card twice.
Right. Well, look, this has been an absolutely fascinating chat. And I really do encourage our listeners to get the book, because I think this gives a different perspective to, I guess, 10, 15-minute news bulletins we all get on News at 10. And Iran, reading about Iran is always fascinating. So, Vali, thank you so much for joining me. A huge, huge pleasure to have you on. Thank you.
Thank you, Oliver. Thanks for having me.
And best of luck with the book.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much for listening. Links are in the show notes. Please share with friends and family. And if you want to get in touch, you can through X or email history@aspectsofhistory.com. But until then, thank you and good night.